Welcome to Framework or Not to Framework.
And we don't have the title up yet, so
Okay,
we can't spoil it.
no spoilers. So, I really like coffee. I'm really into coffee. So, what I wanted to do, want to drink the espresso I get in a restaurant or something. I want to also drink that at home. So I thought of a few ways to do this. So I went into the store and I said, okay, I want to do this. I don't have a lot of money. What do you recommend? And the people in the store said, well, for 20 euros around, you can get this Bialetti mocha pot. You can put it on the stove, very easy. You can make some coffee. And I was like, okay, I'm into this. So I bought the mocha pot, put it on the stove, made some coffee.
How was it?
It was good. It was good. It was not.
Good.
It was not the exact same as in the coffee place, but it was good. So then I went on to buy a Chemex. You know, these glass pots with you put the filter in it, and it's just basically a coffee machine, only without the automatic stuff. And you just pour water in yourself. I didn't really know I bought that. Coffee was better, I have to say, but it wasn't still wasn't, you know, the nice sour acid thingies wasn't there.
So what did you do next?
I bought this cheap espresso machine, which was a terrible idea. I spent like 200 euros. Cheap espresso machine. The pressure was way off, and then I really got into making espresso. So I bought this book, read everything about espresso. You have to have the right temperature. You have to have the right pressure. You have to have the right beans. You have to have the right grain. So the coffee needs to be not too coarse, not too fine. So eventually I settled on buying a machine that will fit my needs and all of the people who drink coffee with me perfectly. So I bought this machine. It's a La Marzocco. I don't know if you know La Marzocco. They have the finest machines on the planet of Earth. You can buy like a piston like that, like a coffee piston. Only you can buy a single one for your home, and it's only $5,000. What up? So, Tom, would you like to have coffee with me?
Well, you also have tea?
I can't make tea with that. Let me just go back to the store. Okay, so this is frameworks. So my framework was coffee, and I really wanted to make coffee, and I'm really into it, and I make the best coffee in the world. But that coffee machine is lousy if you want to make tea, because it will always taste like frothy milk.
It's a metaphor.
Yeah. So, to framework or not to framework? That is the question.
It's a question asked by the first hipster. Boy.
Look at his earring.
Shakespeare, yeah. Cool guy.
Look at him go.
So who are you?
I'm Fritz, and I work at Nele and Schuurmans, which the name is chosen because it sounds so excellent in an international context. So, there you go. Nele and Schuurmans does stuff with geographical web. So anything geographical applications that are concerned with water, we can do that. So we're making a flood model, really cool. Then I'm working on a little project called Twende, which is like an Uber for motor taxis in Kenya. And I do Node.js, I do front-end JS as well, I do Python with Django, and I do Haxi. Who here does and knows Haxi? Yes, we have 3, yes. Which is really cool. You can make like cross-compiling applications, really cool. And I am the frontman of the band Cheese of Mexico, which is also really relevant to this talk. Tom, who are you?
You guys are good at running.
Yes.
Figured, yeah. Well, I'm Tom. I work at Brighton. We're a firm in Utrecht. We do a lot of Rails stuff, a lot of JavaScript stuff. And our goal is to build awesome sites for awesome end users. I sort of translated it from Dutch pretty badly, but that's the English model I'm going for. I have an Ember t-shirt. That's one of the defining characteristics about me. I don't have any GIF, unfortunately. I did make Appuccino, and I've been promoting this at every meetup I spoke at, so I figured this is the biggest one yet, so I have to promote it. Only iOS, unfortunately, but it helps you find coffee nearby. And there's 3 coffee places in walking distance from here. Appuccino will help you find them.
My house should be on there.
Yeah, with your new fancy coffee maker, which you don't really have.
I don't really have it. It's too expensive.
And one more thing about Brighton is it's a very special day today, because our boss It's turning 40 today.
Hey!
And he's here, so it's
Now, would you
awesome
please
for him to
stand
come
up?
out today. Wanted to put him in the spotlight. Yeah. So we're representing Utrecht ES. We're a local JavaScript meetup that Fritz sort of founded, so I'm stealing all his thunder right now. We have meetups about every 2 months, and we talk about everything JavaScript.
Yeah, from the front end. Like maybe you want to only do, if you do jQuery, you can come, but if you do Node.js or I don't know, streaming applications with event-based loops and crazy shit, you can also come. If you make GL applications or I don't know, anything related to JavaScript, even if you don't really use JavaScript but just shaders and you just want to show off, you're also welcome.
And one of the reasons we're here today is we did a talk there, Angular versus Ember, which sort of ended up not as a fight, because you end up in the same place, both frameworks. So we wanted to go one step further for a bigger conference and do to framework or not to framework. So what do you think, Fritz?
Well, I of course think frameworks suck. I've worked with frameworks, many of them. I used Cake PHP, I used Django, I tried to dabble with Rails, wasn't really my style, so I didn't do that. I use Django a lot in my work. I use Angular in the front end. I've used Backbone on the front end, which is even worse. I mean, how can people come up with this complete crap? It serves a purpose, but why? Why would you do that? So whenever people say, I really love that framework, I can only respond with, what do you mean? Because frameworks always tend to solve all of the issues that the contributors have. And I don't necessarily have that issues. I don't like frameworks. It makes it very difficult to progress if you want to do something else. So you want to do something else than the framework intended? Well, sorry, we don't support that, or the documentation is really bad. So then you have to scramble all these different libs together, and that's what I like to do. I like to use modular kind of stuff and then connect it like that, and then maybe if I don't have to use authentication for all the apps I do, so I don't want authentication in my app.
How does it make you feel?
Well, so I start building this stuff myself, and then I realize maybe I do actually need authentication for this app, and then I'm like, oh, I'm so happy with my computer. And then I spend all of these hours and nothing gets done. So what do you think about frameworks?
I think frameworks are pretty cool.
Okay.
Yeah, I've been working on an app called Catstagram, which allows you to share pictures of your cats, which is, I think, the primary function of the internet. And
True.
Well, basically, it's just a web app that follows all of the standard Rails conventions. And I spend a few days just typing. It's pretty simple. And yeah, that means I don't have to spend all this time building everything myself. Turns out some yo-yo made it easy for people to do remote code execution on my server with YAML, but that's okay. If I want authentication, I just grab a plugin, everything's there. It's a huge ecosystem that I can buy into, and yeah, it's really awesome. And in the end, that means I make tons of money building my app.
Yeah, and I just smash my computer and buy expensive espresso machines. Terrible business model, by the way.
Yeah. So we're sort of puzzling ourselves in the extremes. Framework. I think frameworks often evoke this response in people. You either hate it, or you love it, or you do both, which happens most of the time, actually. So we figured we'll ask you guys, which frameworks do you absolutely, completely hate?
Angular, okay. We've got one for Angular. Anyone else for Angular? Who hates Angular?
Angular 1 or Angular 2?
Yes, exactly.
That is exactly the thing you could hate, right? Or not?
Web forms?
Web forms?
Yeah. Classic ASP?
Classic ASP. Who here knows XJS?
Oh yeah.
Shoot it in the face.
I've got a really nice one that might be seen as a framework. WordPress. Yeah. WordPress.
Yeah.
Drupal?
Drupal? Oh yes. That is painful. Anything else? Typo 3? Yeah, don't do that.
Coding 90.
And then frameworks you really love, like almost dogmatically.
Amber.
I'm sorry?
Laravel.
What?
Laravel.
Laravel. Oh yes, I hear that a lot. People are a fan of that. jQuery? Okay. Is jQuery a framework though?
Officially so.
Okay.
But it's based on your definition of a framework.
Yeah.
Framework.
Yeah, exactly.
We'll get to that.
Let's build the framework for framework. And what did you say? Someone over here? WordPress? You love WordPress. Rails. Symfony.
Yeah.
Django.
Angular.
Yeah.
Well, we were talking about this, and you mentioned specifically Angular. I think Django as well is something that you both love and hate.
Yes.
Yeah, and I think the same can be said for Rails a lot of times, because when you're on Rails, when you're on the Rails, you keep going, but when you're off the Rails, you're like the Dutch train service and everything else. So. Yeah. So what is a framework? Good question. Thanks. We've been thinking about this. We were bouncing some ideas of each other, and I think sort of what you mentioned as well is a framework is not as much defined by what it is, but by how you use it. And especially jQuery fits really well into this gray area between, is it a framework, is it a library, are you using it just to do Ajax calls to some remote server? I mean, that's pretty much a library. You're not really buying into it. If you're like building everything in jQuery plugins, you're sort of, yeah, it becomes a framework. You use it as a framework. Here we have a house, which is an interesting metaphor, because there sort of, the framework is the structure. And I think when you're building this part of the house, you're thinking about what is a good idea, how to build a house. And I think the same is true for frameworks. A framework has this preconceived notion of what is a good idea to build. How is it a good idea to build? At least it's an idea. You hope it's a good one. So, for instance, Rails, it really pushes you into a specific kind of app. And Rails is very opinionated and has all these ideas. You should use the CoffeeScript. You should use turbolinks. Not a lot of people like turbolinks. But these are the ideas, and you just get them with your framework. And when you're doing underscore, for instance, you're using underscore, you don't build an underscore app the way you build a Rails app. You build an app and you use underscore. So, are you buying into the ideas of a framework? Then it's a framework. One thing I think that's really defining, especially coming from Rails, we do a lot of Rails, is tools. Rails comes with testing, rake for running tasks, and that way, again, it's ideas that are in the framework, and they push you in a direction. And I think, especially the modern frameworks, they really focus on this idea, that you're not just writing code, but you're structuring your code and using the tools, and an ecosystem. That's really where jQuery shines. I think you have lots of jQuery plugins that run on jQuery in a way. You have a lot of libraries that run on Rails. You don't have any libraries that run on underscore. Nobody says, well, you can only use this in an underscore app. So I think these are the three sort of defining characteristics of what a framework is. Does that clarify a bit?
Did we leave anything out? No? Okay. Cool.
Cool.
I think boilerplate.
Boilerplate.
Yeah, that's sort of an idea. Like, this is how you should structure an app. It's sort of the boilerplate, and I really get that definition there as well. Yeah. Good.
So, to framework or not?
That's the question.
Okay,
Sorry, I
I
had to make
kind of lied at the beginning. I don't hate Django only. I also love it because it makes me really rapidly build something that is much better than I would think of, because it's a collective effort of all these people that have a community. You can just look something up and it will be there, because imagine we wanted to do a single sign-on server, for example, and there was this guy who wrote the Django single sign-on thing. And we could just plug it in and then it would run.
Like the ecosystem thing.
Yeah. So that's cool. So one thing that frameworks do, especially in the JavaScript HTML world, is they bring in the future. You have the future available for you now, because there's mention of, I don't know, promises fetches, all these tools that will come available, but they're not available for all platforms yet. So these frameworks, web components. So one of the really cool things about Angular is if you do it the way that, I don't know, is there an intended way, but if you do it in a certain way, you can build directives that are just this little piece of HTML, and when you enter this little piece of HTML in your code, boom, you have this little component. It's modular. You can publish only that piece of software. You can publish it on NPM. You can have the CSS. You can have the service. You can everything very small and concise in it. But that doesn't mean that you couldn't do it without it. But web components aren't here yet. Sort of. They're coming. But now all of a sudden it's available. And I think the same for Ember. If you use Ember, all of a sudden you have this thing that looks like a web component, and you can use it today, although you want to, well, you don't want to wait for the future.
Yeah, and especially one of the things we noticed with Ember and Angular is that they sort of push this idea of the reactive UI on the website, and something that React took and ran with and does it really well. You see this sort of tendency that a framework introduces this thing because it's big and it allows you a lot of room to experiment and push your ideas again. And then it sort of becomes its own thing and becomes React. And then in a few years it'll probably land somewhere in ES 12 or something.
Yeah.
And then by that time Ember has who knows what, and React becomes what who knows what. So you're sort of a step ahead in sort of unstable territory sometimes, but because there's a big community behind it, it should be sort of tested waters.
Then also, then when it has pushed the future into the realm of the known, like Backbone, for instance, was one of the first doing a model view controller in the browser. Not the first, but it was one that really got a lot of attention. And Backbone is popular, but not as popular anymore because it once pushed that little piece of future into our existence, and then all of a sudden people are like, okay, well, we know now we can do this, maybe we can build it a little better. So yeah, frameworks are really good at bringing the future to us. One more example, who uses Twisted Python? Or Tornado Python? No? No one? Other asynchronous things that normally wouldn't be in your language of choice? Yeah, like Python 3 is coming and it has a lot of cool asynchronous stuff, but then you can't use it in a browser when you use Django, but then when you use Twisted, all of a sudden this whole callback kind of evented loop comes available.
Node in your Python.
I'm sorry?
It's like Node in your Python.
It's like Node in your Python before Node was born. Yeah, so. Okay.
You like Yetis?
I like Yetis because they're big. And that is, on the one hand, the good thing about frameworks. Frameworks are really big because they try to cover a lot of bases, like a lot of things that you need to do. But then that's also the problem. I mean, there's always a thing you don't like. But then behind that is the whole ecosystem, the community that, I don't know, it will help you do something bigger. So you use a framework and then you stand taller. So you should actually imagine yourself sitting on top of this Yeti. This is how tall you will be with using a framework.
What if the Yeti goes the direction you don't want it to go?
Well, then you're screwed because you're on the back of his neck. And that's again why I think frameworks suck. And sort of not. Yeah. So my personal preference is non-opinionated frameworks, or not so very much opinionated frameworks. Like Rails and Ember really push this idea they have about how an app should look like, what it should be structured like, how you should use it, how you should use a command line even. It scares me. I don't like that. I like things like Django or little node components you can plug into. Like Django, you can use an app and then run the app separately, or like I said with a web component thing you use in directive, you can just take that and run it separately, or you could plug it in and it could be part of a creative system. I think this is also possible with Rails and Ember, but usually it also drives a certain way of, you don't have to think about the database. Don't worry, I'll do that.
And you're sort of pushed in that direction. They split up Rails into several components. After a while, it started out as this big single thing. And then I mean, not a lot of people split it. I mean, you usually tend to use the package. We were discussing earlier today about Flask, sort of like a micro framework for Python, a bit like Sinatra for Ruby. I don't know if there's a PHP equivalent. There probably is.
Is there a yeah, probably. Sling. Okay. Well, it's really small and it doesn't really have an opinion. It just says, here's HTTP and a way to rapidly set that up. Good luck.
And the point was, like, is it still a framework then? It sort of becomes a library, even though it does a lot of what Django does. Like the core of Django, building a web app, is still there.
Yeah.
But it's become so modular that it's not really a framework anymore.
You don't have to use authentication, you don't have to use a database. You can just, I don't know, use text files. Yeah. Okay, so then we also can talk about complexity, because usually with a JavaScript app or a Python app, whatever app you're building, you're just hacking along, and then all of a sudden you hit this next level of complexity where you want to plug in, I don't know, you want to talk to the database. Then you have to reiterate everything you've done if you haven't done it the right way, and especially for JavaScript. Imagine you're building a cool new app with the Harmony flag on, and you can do object observable. Do you know what object observable is? You can have this little hash table sort of in the browser, and it can be observed by the browser in an event loop. And if it changes, then it triggers a change, or it triggers an event. Stuff that Ember and Angular do internally. But then you have to support Internet Explorer 8. No. Then all of a sudden this level of complexity just grows exponentially.
Because basically you end up having to build your own framework.
Yeah.
In a way.
Yeah, to have all these if statements and crazy crap. And then for an Ember app or an Angular app or a Knockout app, the initial complexity is quite high, so you have to really invest in getting to know this framework. But then after a while, it doesn't really get that much more complex. You can sort of go with it. But the first, especially the first step, is just very painful if you really don't like Ember, or if you really don't want to learn. So if you don't want to learn, don't do frameworks.
Yeah, the one thing that I think is wrong about this image is that if you're doing an Ember app and you're building something and it turns out it's not really a good fit for Ember, the curves just go straight up, because you're just wrestling against the framework, making it a fight.
A fight to death.
Like this.
So to framework or to framework, that's the question.
Yeah. So, questions?
How do you think about how much you should couple your business logic to the framework?
Yeah, that's a good question. Especially if you have like these smart queries with I use Django, so for example with Django you have these really cool way in piping queries, but then if you want to use something else, then you're screwed. You have to really rewrite this thing. So what I like about Django, for example, is that you can use the ORM and you can switch it out with something else. I don't know if you can also do this in Rails.
Yeah.
You can use your own ORM. So you could choose to then either or roll your own, which you shouldn't do, but change it to an ORM that is more agnostic. But then again, are you really going to change your framework if you are building something?
I'd like to say, because one thing you can add to frameworks is the promise of independence. You can switch this out, you can switch that out, you can switch to a different database, but I mean, I don't know anybody alive who's ever done that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Why would you do that?
You never do it. You never switch an ORM, you
Yeah.
never switch to your database. It's just to make you feel safer.
Yeah.
You haven't thrown your life in the hands of somebody who's maintaining the framework.
What about a new version of the framework?
A new version of the framework. That's something else. But that is.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's sort of like the Yeti going in a direction you weren't expecting, or maybe that's it's jumping and you have a hard time holding on. And
Yeah, all of a sudden you have to rewrite your migrations or something like that. But then again, migrations are also weird. Would you really want to go back to an older version of your migration table and then use an older version of your software? I've never done this. Is there a reason to go back to, okay, maybe like one small version, but not like a major version go back. It's true. Frameworks, they promise you the world, but then you only use Indonesia. Someone else, yeah?
I feel there is a difference between the front-end browser kind of part for frameworks and the back-end part because, for instance, jQuery was mainly meant in the beginning to solve cross-browser problems.
Mm-hmm.
The same is true for, I don't know if you guys consider things like Babel.js or even TypeScript to be a framework or not. Can you comment on the difference between choosing a framework or not on the browser part or versus the backend part? Is that different or?
I don't think it is. I mean, they are different things in the sense that they try to solve different problems. And there's different flavors of framework, both front and back. But in the end, they both have a preconceived notion, and especially something like Ember, which really buys into the Rails way of doing things. There's like a lot of similarities there, and of course it's implemented a little differently because it's a different environment. But the way you use it, I think in other ways is similar. You buy into a big framework, you suffer when it doesn't do what you want it to do, you flourish when you do what it wants you to do. And I think if you're thinking about choosing which framework to use or whether or not to use a framework, the thought process is very similar. Like, is this framework promising what I want or what I'm expecting to do? And that works both on the back end and on the front end, I think.
You also told this anecdote of this guy that didn't want to. They built everything themselves from scratch because they didn't trust. What was it, like the Rails authentication layer?
Yeah, the device. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean. Yeah. Okay.
So where you go?
But
yeah.
like to answer your question a bit, I mean, with Babel and TypeScript, it's kind of difficult to say if it's a framework or is it just that part of bringing the future into the now. That's what they try to do, right? I mean, they know what the specification of ECMAScript 6 or JavaScript in the future is going to be, and they say, okay, well, you can have it now. You can use all that cool syntactic sugar or the cool new features, and we'll build something in the old JavaScript that all browsers will support.
Yeah, that's what if I rephrase my question a bit, isn't a framework in the browser kind of mandatory if you want to support a lot of browsers, whereas on the back-end server-side kind of thing, you have lots of more options not to use a framework because you don't have to deal with that kind of problem.
Yeah, that might be true, and especially the browser. I mean, it's such a different space. Everything can be different on someone else's machine. Yeah, there's almost no choice. You want to use a framework, otherwise you're just basically screwed.
I think for the backend, it's the main defining thing is that you're doing HTTP requests, for instance, if you're doing a web framework, and that's one thing that's often abstracted for you, and that's something a problem you don't want to solve yourself. I mean, you could be writing a rake. For PHP, it's maybe a bit different, but for Ruby and Python, you need some kind of layer for you to process web requests. And that's something that you can do with Flask, with like a micro framework, but you're still, or maybe a library, but you're still using something to abstract the hard part, basically, the part you don't care that much about. And that's probably the same on the front end, only the part you don't care about is, or you don't want to care about is different.
Even if you only do server-side rendering, you would still have to use some, I don't know, solving on the browser. I saw two questions. First, the gentleman in the orange.
The problem with the frameworks is that you can have a situation where the community will let you down in the future. The community moves on to the new hype, and you're left behind with your big, whatever, Rails app.
Yeah. And then what do? Do you stay on the old version? Or do you...
What would you do?
Yeah, what would you do? Yeah, that's a good question. Especially because, for example, in Rails and Django, they support this version up to a certain point, and they say, well, now it's deprecated. So now you either use... For Django, this is very relevant right now because we went from 1.6 to 1.7, and then now we're on 1.8 going to 1.9. But 1.6 is just deprecated, but 1.7 has completely new migration structure. Okay, so what do we do? And then you finally find out that maybe the new way of doing things is actually better, but then that takes some time and some I don't know, Peter talked about emotion this morning. It kind of, you
hurts.
feel defeat. You're like, damn it, I thought I wrote everything so well. It's done, right?
And it
Yeah.
will cost you time.
Yeah, it will cost a lot of time.
But couldn't you have done it right for you by yourself from the start?
Yeah.
That also.
Oh, what do you
time.
think?
Depends. Depends on how large your project is.
Yeah.
How long will it run in the future?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, but these are exactly the kind of questions that you sort of get when you're doing, when you're asking, should I use this framework? And I think for Rails, one of the things it has going for it is Basecamp, the company that supports it. They are running Rails in production, and as long as they're doing their thing, you can probably assume that
GitHub.
they're probably.
GitHub.
Yeah, but I mean, GitHub is not really the main stakeholder. I mean, if Basecamp decides that they want to start baking cookies instead, well, then you're screwed. But as long as that doesn't happen, at least your Rails will probably be processing web requests.
But that doesn't hold up, because Twitter used to use Rails, and they dropped it like really bad back in the day.
Yeah, but
That's not like an argument to say you can use Rails because they use Rails.
no, but
They can drop it.
Basecamp is the guys who one of the guys who works there is the guy who founded Rails, who's like the core guy behind Rails. So.
It's no guarantee.
No, it's no
you're
guarantee,
right.
but it's. As
But it
close
does
as you're
help
gonna
making
get.
a decision. Like if you're looking for a framework, you're not going to
Mhm.
use a framework that nobody uses, or just like these small little web companies. You're going to do something that
Yeah.
big companies use, right?
And I mean, if you're talking about Twitter, Rails, Basecamp isn't Twitter. The only guys building Twitter is Twitter. So if you're saying, well, a framework should be something that supports what I'm trying to do, nobody supports what Twitter's trying to do except Twitter. So it makes sense for them to drop just your regular old web framework.
Your question. Is it still relevant?
Yeah, might be.
Okay.
I like to use Zen framework
Okay.
because it has use at will components, so you can either just use a few components or use a full MVC stack. But if you use a full MVC stack, you vendor your templates in backend. That's the idea of Zen framework. But then I find with the companies I work for as a contractor that usually the JavaScripts end up like a real mess. They're not as well organized as the PHP code. And is there any framework you would recommend to use on top of Zen framework on the client for JavaScript that would have the same qualities, use at will, etc.?
Amber? This guy goes, Amber. Anyone's what would you recommend for a front-end framework?
Well, again, depends on what you want to achieve.
Yeah, of course.
Is it just graphical fun on the website? You
Organization.
change whatever.
Some level of organization.
Like,
That's the thing about Ember is
that's
that
the
it's
programmer's
really,
fault.
Ember is really tied to the way of, well, not tied, but mirrors the way Rails does things. I'm not sure if there's a similar thing for Zend, but basically the structure of if you run a Rails new app and Ember new app, it's basically the same to a certain extent. Only one is JavaScript front-end stuff and the other does back-end stuff. So there's that structure is really strong. I don't know if Angular has similar sort of thing going on right now. Did when I started.
There is no forced structure. So if you really want structure, you could use Ember. But still, if you have a programmer which isn't that experienced, let me just say it very diplomatically, then it still could look like a mess. So yeah, I don't know. I don't know if I have a solution for your problem. But you could try to strip everything away and make sure that the front end does as little as possible, which is difficult with rich applications like rich web app. Yeah.
I was wondering, Mark, in frameworks you say it's often opinionated, and I think that's true, that you can think differently about it. At least it's a shared opinion. So it means that if there's a new member coming to the team, it makes it much easier to understand how the application is built.
Yeah, well, that's your opinion, man. No, that's very true. Like, you want to have some consensus. Like, all these little ants that Peter talked about, they already went into this direction and decided, okay, now that is a very bad path. That will lead to death and utter destruction, so let's not do that. Let's go this way. But then you have to support that opinion with the community. Yeah.
It sort of goes back to the slide about the... I can actually do that. This one is when you're. You can do this again if you have a new member on the team. If you get someone new and you put them in an Ember app, they have to learn Ember plus your app, which is more than learning just assuming they already know JavaScript.
You have a new member to the team who knows Ember already.
Well, that's really nice.
Yeah,
but
that would help.
yeah, that then you can skip a lot of the first part, and then you get to the easy part right away.
Yeah. But that rarely happens, right?
No.
Because most of the things you have documented, code Ember is documented, the JavaScript app written by one person only with tunnel vision.
Yeah.
Do you expect documentation of that part?
No.
Yes, of course.
Yeah, no, it's true. Also with a community you can
Yeah.
build documentation, you can make it easier to start, and you can make it easier for people to learn how to use it. Yeah.
Yeah, good point.
Yes.
So you guys are talking about back-end and front-end frameworks. What about a combination like Meteor.js?
Yeah, we were thinking about that. I actually used. Do you guys know Meteor.js? Yeah. Who's a big fan of Meteor?
I'm a
Okay,
little
so
fan of Meteor.
okay, I tried to build an app with Meteor this year, and it's really cool. I mean, instant, everything, very cool. But then if you want to include some Node modules, it gets kind of more difficult, and then you finally find out, okay, now I can do this, and then all of a sudden, okay, well, it's still a browser on the phone, so if I press back, it just goes back to the previous page. What's going on? And then you have to propagate default error. You have to all do. I don't know. It's cool, but then you also have to do that always. I mean, it doesn't leave a lot of room for other things. Or do you know a way to like switch out servers maybe?
You can switch out. It's basically modularized, so you can switch out most of the entire system.
Oh, okay. Well, then maybe I'll have another look.
You can even, if you dive into the internals, you can even switch out the template rendering and everything like that.
Okay. Well.
Yeah, they support
Cool.
React now out of the box.
Yeah,
Yeah.
of course.
Now, but especially for Meteor, I think you're really buying into a certain type of application. You're building something that Meteor supports.
The data-driven protocol, right? That's
Yeah, and then you're building a sort of this live updating HTML thingy with
Which-
MongoDB.
Well, you don't
Which
have
you
to
don't
use
always-
MongoDB.
No,
I actually
but-
used RethinkDB for that. That was also pretty cool.
But you're really pushed into that direction.
Yeah. Anyways, that is a cool direction. If you like that direction, you should try it out. Yeah. Any more things? Otherwise, we have to wrap it up. I think.
What is time-based? Like, you guys were also talking about frameworks. So from my knowledge, most JavaScript frameworks that I've seen used, they have a life cycle of around a year per app, while the backend stuff I've worked on is like
10 years old.
I've still stuff running from 8 years back.
As in, you wrote that? That is.
That's based on the framework, which is actually we're still getting security updates on it.
Yes. Okay. So, but you wrote that 8 years back, or are you still using the framework that is 8 years old?
We're still.
Okay.
I wrote it 8 years back, and we only updated.
Yeah, I think it's getting better, JavaScript frameworks, but it's still kind of a mess. I mean, some stuff really gets updated magnificently. The backbone is pretty good. Angular is also still pushing updates for their older versions, although they're trying to get people to move away from that. But they also understand, okay, you can't, after a product is finished, or a project is finished, always come back and update the code, because otherwise everything breaks.
I think maybe that's just my view of things, but the JavaScript world in general is just moving. It's been moving really fast the last couple of years. So it sort of makes sense that these newish ideas are like sort of moving around in the framework world as well.
And browsers don't really
And browsers.
respect people.
No.
Browsers are really irrespectful of people. It's hard,
Browsers
we should
hate
sue
people,
them.
yeah.
No, but seriously, like Chrome even, like you would expect, okay, they're on the cutting edge, and now why don't my images work?
Why don't your images work?
Yeah, I don't know. I still don't know. So, but when you close the tab and then reopen it, it works. So then it's fine, right? I mean, which user doesn't know that?
Well, you're using Chrome.
Yeah. One more question?
Yeah, no, it was actually a remark. You guys already summed it up. So it's, I think the whole thing is that the whole JavaScript and web development in general is very immature.
Mm-hmm.
We're just at the starting point, I guess. So this whole discussion, I think we should maybe postpone it for over 5 years and then see what happened.
Amen. We're trying to bring the future into the now.
Yeah. But talk to the organizers and have them invite us again in 5 years. Maybe we can get the big room then. Yeah. Big
But
room.
it's not just JavaScript. I mean,
Yeah, so the browser end of things.
There's no continuity.
Yeah.
It's really moving.
Flash.
Yeah.
With writing, so.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, of course, but it's what happens, yeah.
Yeah, but then again, I mean, some of these it sort of comes back to the idea behind the framework, and Silverlight's just a bad idea. So.
But imagine if Silverlight still supported their API, only they would have done that on the HTML5 principles. I mean, it would have been pretty good, I think. Like, I don't like using it, but if you, or Flash, the same thing, it does really cool shit. So why not try to remap that API to function under a HTML5 app? Ah, well, that's why they
They
didn't do
should have
it.
tried harder.
Yeah, but yeah, no, I don't know. People just hated it after a while. Okay, I think we have to wrap it up, right?
Now we have 5 minutes. But,
5 minutes. Okay.
If nobody else has any questions, if you still have questions, that's okay. If you don't have questions, we can get coffee before the other group.
How do you make a choice between server-side rendering and front-end rendering?
Yes.
That depends on your use case.
Yeah. Well, I try to render JSON from the backend. So do no DOM updates from the, like, don't render DOM on the backend, or do that and then only change the rest, like React can do.
Well, that's one of the really interesting things about Rails is really pushing you to render everything on the backend and then push snippets of HTML to your browser instead of JSON. And that's the turbo links thing, and I think they're the only guys who do it, and then nobody else is. Are you doing it? You using turbo links?
No, we're not using it. Netflix has a great study on their UI revamp where
Okay,
they
cool.
partially run the backend and then render the rest in the client on all their platforms. So like from the PlayStation to the phone to the TVs and everything. And they made a study on which like portion of their entire app would be rendered server side and which would be rendered client side based on performance metrics.
Okay.
And what did they find out?
They did the first 10% or the 10 most active screens were rendered server side, and the rest would be rendered client side, and that was like the ideal.
It's also difficult. You don't want to. I saw this one study saying, well, if everything is rendered front end side, we have to use a lot more computers. So eventually, we will destroy the world because we need more energy. Which I think is a very fascinating study. If you look at it like that, it's very interesting. But then again, if you want to have Angular or Ember take over your front-end side, you don't want all this stuff from the other things. You want as much control in the front end as you want. But then, I think that's a very good point. So you said 10%, or you, okay, that's not that much.
I think that's one of the things that maybe Meteor could promise, because it's an all integration full stack thing, and it could probably, you could say 10%, do 10% server side, 90% client side, and be done with it.
Yeah. Anyways, Netflix does really cool stuff. So if you are looking into building cooler web apps, look at their videos, their talks. They really have awesome talks on everything from Node to, I don't know, moving your app away from monolithic stuff.
We can do one more question?
Yeah. No. Done.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.